Yeah. So good evening. Welcome everyone. My name is Taner Akçam, and I have the privilege of serving as the inaugural director of the Armenian Genocide Research Program at the Promise Armenian Institute at UCLA. It is truly a pleasure to welcome you all here tonight, and I'm especially delighted to introduce our dear friend, Dr. Julian Zarifyan. Julian, we met in 2003 or 2004 in Canada when he was still a graduate student, like you, Ben. So, and Julian will be discussing his newly published and incredible timely book, The United States and the Armenian Genocide, History, Memory, Politics. This groundbreaking work is the first comprehensive study how and why the United States refused to acknowledge the Armenian genocide until the early 20th century, 2020s, while the American government initially expressed sympathy for the plight of Armenians during and immediate after the genocide. Julian's research shed light on a critical question. What led the United States from the 1960s onward to adopt a policy of genocide non-recognition, one it would uphold for over 60 years across both Republican and Democratic presidential administrations? What were the geopolitical, domestic, and institutional factors that shaped this long-standing policy of resistance to recognition? Tonight's event is co-sponsored and co-organized and generously supported by the UCLA Richard Hovhannisyan Endowed Chair in Modern Armenian History. Thank you, Sebu. And we also extend our appreciation to NASER, National Association for Armenian Studies and Research, for their co-sponsorship. Before I hand over the things to Aslanian, Professor Aslanian, one of the key organizer of tonight's event, who will introduce our speaker formally, I would like to go over a few procedural details. This is a hybrid event and will be recorded for future viewing on our platform. If you experience any connections issues, please simply reconnect using the same link. After Julian's talk, we will open the floor for a question and answer session. If you are joining us via Zoom, please submit your questions using the Q&A section of your screen, and we will relay them to our speaker. And now I have the pleasure of inviting Dr. Sebu Aslanian, holder of Richard Hovhannisyan Chair in Modern Armenian History at the History Department, to introduce tonight's speakers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Taner, for that introduction. Thank you all for being here. I join my colleague, Dr. Akçam, in welcoming you all to this important event organized by the Armenian Genocide Research Program at the Promise Institute and happily co-sponsored by the Hovhannisyan Chair of Modern Armenian History, which I presently hold. We are truly honored and thankful to have Dr. Julian Zarifyan join us today in making this event possible. After my brief introduction, Dr. Zarifyan will deliver his talk titled The United States and the Armenian Genocide, History, Memory, and Politics. He will speak for roughly 50 minutes, following which we will open the floor, as Dr. Akçam clarified earlier, to the audience members, especially those joining us via Zoom. So I will take this opportunity to remind everyone, especially those on Zoom, to write your questions as succinctly as possible, be direct, and to post them on the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen. And we will entertain as many of these questions as possible, and we look forward to a vigorous discussion with our speaker. But before I turn over the podium to Dr. Zarifian, let me say a few words about this distinguished speaker that we have with us today. Julien Zarifian is professor of U.S. history at the Université de Poitiers in France, and a fellow at the Institut Universitaire de France from 2020 to 2025. Dr. Zarifian received his PhD in geopolitics from the French Institute of Geopolitics at Paris 8, I think, in 2010, and is currently a visiting scholar at the American University in Washington, D.C. Between 2011 and 2022, he was associate professor at CY Cergy, Paris Université. Forgive me for butchering the CY part. And he was also a Fulbright Fellow at UC Berkeley in 2007, and especially at the formidable Shoah Foundation at USC in 2017, a time when I had the pleasure of first making his acquaintance. His current research involves the place of memory issues in US politics and policies. Dr. Zarifian is the author of 3 important monographs, including his Les États-Unis au Sud-Caucase, Post-Soviétique, Arménie, Azerbaijan, et Géorgie, the United States in the post-Soviet Caucasus, South Caucasus, Armenia, Georgia, and Azerbaijan, published in 2012, his first monograph, and of course, followed by his second book, titled Choc d'Empire, Les relations États-Unis-Iran du 19e siècle à nos jours, published in 2018. Most recently, of course, he is the author in English of The United States and the Armenian Genocide, History, Memory, and Politics, published just recently, last year, from Rutgers University Press. This magnificent work provides an incisive analysis of an about-face turn in genocide awareness by American heads of state during the unfolding of the genocide itself to a resolute policy of non-recognition and avoidance of the topic during the Cold War. Reflecting on the traces left behind by this complex history and shifting history, Zarifian clarifies the main findings of his rich investigation, and I quote here from the book which I started reading last night. And he says here in the summary, the main objective of this study has been to understand how and why it was possible for the United States to pursue and maintain this policy of non-recognition of a widely recognized genocide for so long, and to understand the radical switch from a policy of support for the Armenians and de facto awareness of the genocidal character of the massacres of 1915 when they took place, to a policy of rejection of the claims by Armenian survivors and their heirs for recognition and support. So without any further delay, I now invite Dr. Zarifian to the podium, and I ask you to welcome him as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Sibu. Thank you very much, Taner. Well, it is my great pleasure to be here. There would be many things I could say before I start my talk, but I'll keep this short. Many things because I have a very special relationship with this city, Los Angeles, where I lived for 1 year, as Sibu kindly reminded. So it's always a pleasure to be here, to come back. Also, I want to just say a word on the fires and on the fact that I know that you guys have experienced a difficult moment, a trauma, and I wanted to have a thought, about that, and to start my talk by a thought for those of you who suffered most from this fires. Of course, I want to thank very much the organizers and sponsors of the events. So the Promise Armenian Institute, Taner Aksham in particular, and Nano Artunian, who made this possible. There is Anne as well, and Perigosian. So thank you very much to the Promise Institute. Thank you very much to Sebu Aslanyan, and to the Richard Ovanessian Chair in Modern Armenian History. And many thanks also to Nasser and Mark Mamigonian in Boston, in the Boston area. Okay, so I think we can get started with the first slide, if it's fine, which is basically the title of. So I made a very basic PowerPoint. I'm not very good with that, but at least we have a few pictures and a few written words. So anyway, so my idea tonight is to keep this relatively short and casual, informal. It's a difficult task actually to give a presentation about the book, mostly because a book is long and a talk is necessarily short. So I'll try to sum up the best way I can the book. It's also difficult because I'm not sure about your level of knowledge, the audience here and online. So I'll try to find a good balance between something too broad and something too sharp. Anyway, so for me, it all started a long time ago with a question, basic question, and we can turn to the next slide. When my country, France, recognized the Armenian genocide after a relatively long process, but not as long as in the US. So the formal recognition was made by a vote in the French Senate in 2001. I was at that time an undergrad student in history. And this whole thing in France, I followed it, of course, with interest, led me to a basic question on the US. And this basic question was why the US has not or had not at that time recognized the genocide yet. And today, why now it has recognized the genocide, as Taner Aksham said. So why it took so long, basically, to the US to recognize the Armenian genocide. But what's interesting here, and why I'm insisting a bit on this first question I asked to myself, is that in a way, this basic question I asked to myself at that time, that intrigued me in a way, is more or less the main research question of this book. So based on a question, simple question I had a long time ago. And I think, I don't know, you guys, some of you wrote books here in this audience, and I don't know if it's the same with you, but in my case, it all started with a very simple question, and this question remained the same actually until I decided to start my research on it, and even when I wrote the book, the question changed, evolved, became more sophisticated, more intellectual in a way, but remained the same. I wanted to understand the reasons why the US had not at that time recognized the Armenian genocide. So it started with the question, and of course, when you are a graduate student in history, you have this type of question. You start reading to get information, hopefully to get answers. So that's what I did. And what I found was not, how to put it, did not really convince me, I'd say. First of all, at that time in the early 2000s, but it was true, it's been true until recently actually, there was almost no books or book chapters, articles, academic research on the topic. There was nothing of that kind, or very little. I'll say a few words about it later. So there was not much in terms of academic production. So I relied mostly on newspaper articles and op-ed, op-ed styles, essay styles, the short articles and so on, the few things I found. Talking of the beginning of the 2000s and even a bit later. And the answer to my basic question, the answer I found in these articles was in a way even more basic than the question, probably, as it can be summed up in one word: Turkey. So basically, if the US had not recognized the Armenian genocide, had shaped this policy of non-recognition, maintained it throughout the years, I mean the decades, it was because of Turkey. And I had this sort of intuition that it was, or I don't know how to call it, opinion maybe, or I don't know, that it may not be enough. That just this simple argument, Turkey, and behind Turkey, of course, there is the geopolitical arguments, was may not be enough, and that actually such a complex topic needed to be handled academically speaking, and digged and discussed, and so on. So that's basically how I started to have this idea to possibly work on this question. We can go to the next slide, I presume. Yeah, so I should have turned to this slide before. So that's basically to just a few illustration of what I've just said, that most of the time the focus is on Turkey when it comes to explaining or trying to understand this non-recognition policy by the United States. Well, I will develop later, but of course, I'm not saying that Turkey and this geopolitical argument is not important. It definitely is. It is the most important one for sure. But I had this idea, and then my research proved, I hope I'm convincing with the book, but proved that I was right, that it was not enough to get the whole picture. Anyway, so that was basically how it started. So we were in the 2000. In 2005, I started to do my PhD on a different topic. Sebou mentioned the book. The first book was actually my PhD. But still, I kept an interest on the topic. I kept reading what was published, especially in the news again. A few book chapters as well, and we can go to the next slide, please. And so actually, there was very, very little scholarship on the topic as I wanted it to be studied, or relating to the main question I asked. So a few books were published. This one, all of these ones, I think in the 2000s, not the one edited by Richard Ovanesian. I think it was in the late 1990s. But anyway, and there were others, of course, but these are some of the books that I read and was interested in. But as you can see it, or as you may know it, actually, most of them focus on the period of the genocide itself, and a bit before and a bit later, up to the 20s, 30s maximum. In my opinion, the one that, let's say, helped me most, and that the one that I used most in my own research, was Simon Vayaslian's book, United States Policy Toward the Armenian Question and the Armenian Genocide. But I was also very interested by Children of Armenia by Michael Bobelian, published in 2009, if I'm not mistaken. And I was happy to see that in Bobelian's book, there is 1 or 2 chapters, maybe 3, or some sections of some chapters dealing with the topic that interested me and still interests me, the issue of the non-recognition of the Armenian genocide. The thing in Bobelian's book and in other publications, shorter text, maybe Samantha Power and possibly other authors, the focus was not so much on the reasons why the US kept this position, this line of non-recognition. It was mostly, describing and analyzing the facts, and that was great and needed to be done. But I was still interested in the reasons, and so that's why basically I understood that at the end of the 2000s and early 2010s, I started really to consider that there may be room enough for maybe not a book, but at least a serious study, academic study on the topic. It's also an important time for me, because I was recruited as an associate professor in 2011 at the University of Cergy-Pontoise, CY Cergy Paris Université, as Sebou mentioned. And I was recruited in American history, US politics. And I started to consider that I maybe one of the good scholars capable of undertaking this kind of project, which is basically at the crossroads of all my fields of interest, disciplines, and so on. That is to say, the US on the one side, US history, political history, US studies as well, with the focus on ethnicity, the link between ethnicity and politics through ethnic lobbying in particular, etc. On the one hand, and other hand, Armenian history, the Armenian genocide, and genocide studies in general. Basically, that was my and still is my academic profile, let's say. So I decided that there was definitely something to do. So I had basically the topic. I had this main question, research question, that would become a bit, more sophisticated, different, and so on, but that I started to raise, at least to myself, when I was a student, as I said before. I had also this hypothesis that, okay, the Turkish determinant was significant, but that first of all, this Turkish determinant, this geopolitical argument should be studied, discussed, better understood first, and second, that there may be other determinants to take into account. So I had this main hypothesis. So now what I had to do was basically to opt for an approach, and then the architecture of the book, the outline, and so on. Of course, in relation with the sources. That's always a major question. And I think we can go to the next slide. So my approach that is more or less summed up here in the first part, and then the main question that I raised in the book in the second part. The approach was not so easy to decide in a way. As you probably understood it with the title of the book and what we just said, I opted for a diachronic approach. I decided to study the object or the subject on its long run, on its long period, on its temps long, as to use Fernand Braudel's main concept. Okay, that is to say more than 100 years. I could have done differently, and to be honest with you, it took me a few months to decide. I could have focused on one episode, one president, one I don't know, the State Department, and the question of the non-recognition of the Armenian genocide. That could have been an idea, or President Reagan and the question, whatever, or President Obama. That could have been an option, definitely. Or I could have focused on one or several congressional episodes, when what I'll discuss in a few minutes, when basically the Armenian camp, that is to say the organized Armenian community, the Armenian lobbies, to make it clear, push Congress to vote to pass resolution recognizing the Armenian genocide. I could have focused on one of these episodes because they're all fascinating. I mean, I've studied them quite much in the book. Not always enough, but quite much already, and they're all different and fascinating. But anyway, I considered in the end that as the old picture had not been taken in a way already, I had to do it first. I had to sort of clear and set the ground, and then I may myself or other scholars hopefully may work on some more targeted events, episodes, situations, people, and so on. If I may just a short parenthesis, I know now, I'm convinced that there's a topic. I don't know why it had not been really discussed before, because there is definitely a topic. I mean, several ones actually, and interesting ones and fascinating ones. And this topic actually tells a lot about the US politics. There is definitely a US side to this coin. There is also an Armenian genocide one. It tells a lot about the Armenian genocide as not only an historical fact, but also as a geopolitical, sociological, cultural, etc., etc. So there's definitely a topic. Every time I try to publish an article, publish the book, give a talk in a conference, whatever, I was always welcome, easily accepted, and there is an interest. Now, I really don't know why it had not been studied before, or hardly. I mean, we had a few things, but very little. I don't have the explanation. But anyway, so there's a lot to do, and hopefully we'll continue the work on this topic. Anyways, so that's why I decided to opt for this, long-run diachronic, chronological mostly, although not only, but approach. So now, in terms of, so I knew that with this approach, I mean, there is a lot of positive things and interest in opting for a diachronic approach. In my opinion, I'm a big fan, to be honest, because it really gives the scholar the opportunity to precisely work on every, period, events, and so on, without omitting one or the other. So I like the approach. Now, it's also quite pedagogical, in my opinion, and now there are also more, let's say, negative sides, of course, when you opt for this kind of approach, or not negative, but difficulties and so on. One of them was the question of the sources. So basically, I decided to use as many sources as possible. Of course, secondary sources, obviously, and then primary sources, mostly official documents emanating both from the executive branch and, of course, congressional record, and also the documents emanating from the hearings of the committees and so on. Now, for the executive branch, I could not spend as much time as I had wanted to on every single, presidency or points that I wanted to raise or discuss. So I went through as many documents as possible, archival documents, official documents, and so on. But I'm sure that there may be more. I'm sure there are more, actually. And in any case, that's something we may discuss later if you're interested. But the question of the National Archives relating to the Armenian genocide, the Armenian question, is really not easy. And first of all, it's difficult to know actually what was archived or what has been archived and what has not. I mean, what type of discussions, meetings, and so on, where it depends quite much on the presidency and so on. Some presidencies, for example, are famous not to leave too many documents. I mean, they do leave a lot, but for example, the Reagan administration tried not to publish too much after Nixon and so on. Maybe also the personality of Reagan, whatever. Anyway, so that's difficult, and there are many things also which are in any case not systematically decided in venues or where you'll have where you'll have record of in any case. So that makes things difficult. And then there is the issue of classification, of course. And for the Armenian genocide, I was told that some documents had this 50-year classification. So all this make the archival work complex. And in a way, the fact that I was opting for this diachronic approach probably solved a bit the problem, as I didn't have to spend years in the Nixon archives, for example, because I didn't have room enough anyway to, just a few pages, for example, on Nixon. That was the project as it was, and I think it was good this way. Anyway, and the last point with regards to the sources is that I could use the whole series of two remarkable Armenian weekly newspapers, weekly magazine. They are the Armenian Hayrenik and then Armenian Weekly, and the Armenian Mirror Spectator. So that definitely helped. I mean, when I could access this document, my research almost changed, actually, because I could point out people, names. I had more like factual information, and that of course I had to double check most of the time, but it was not so difficult to do it. So that was really precious. So that's it about the sources. Okay, so the outline of this book, and maybe we can go to the next slide, please. And so basically, this book is divided into 6 parts. Each part having 3 chapters, so it's 18 chapters. But actually, I think the book can also be divided into 3 like big parts or big segments, and these are the segments I'm referring to. So the first segment, and it's actually 1 or 2 parts of the book, or 1 part and a half, I'd say, is basically the historical part relating to the genocide itself, to the policies of the United States during the genocide. And I started actually a bit before, and I went a bit after the 20s in particular. So I'd say that in this part, I use mostly secondary sources, works by Taner Aksham and by many others, Simon Payaslian in particular, and many others. I also use some primary sources, congressional report in particular, the congressional record as well, and other documents emanating from the executive branch. But my idea here in this part is only to set the ground. I mean, and the core of the study comes later. In this historical part, I try to show, but it's well known and documented, but I try to show that the relationship of the United States with the Armenian massacres and with the Armenians when the massacres took place was relatively strong. That of course the US supported the Ottoman Armenians politically, in terms of humanitarian help, assistance as well. But I tried to show that this assistance this support, let's say, this support in general was complex and should be nuanced. And that's basically, I'd say, probably one of the main points of this part. But that's not something entirely new, I presume. But I hope I still bring my view on these issues. Then the second major segment of the book, and probably the core of this research, relates mostly to the political struggle of Armenian Americans to get the genocide recognized, mostly in Congress, between the early 70s up to 2019. However, I think this big second part, starts before, as I start actually with the Armenian, what we call the Armenian awakening, or sort of renaissance of the Armenian cause in 1965, as you probably know, with the 50th anniversary of the Armenian genocide. But actually, I start this before, with the Second World War, the genocide of European Jews, the UN, the 1948 UN Convention on Genocide, and how the 40s basically participated in this awakening or reawakening before 1965. However, that really was the beginning for the Armenians, and particularly Armenian Americans. And the focus obviously in the 40s, but even in the 50s, 60s, was not so much the genocide, as a term, as a concept. The idea was more the Armenian cause in a sort of historical sense of the term, relating to the lands, to the territories, reparation, and so on. And it was mostly advanced at that time by, of course, activists for those of you who are familiar with the Armenian political party, and the parties, I presume most of you, the Dashnak party in particular, but also other groups. And yeah, so the mobilization at that time was not on genocide as a term that should be used and only used and so on. That came a bit later. And that came actually, in my opinion, from my understanding, in the early 70s. I'd say that in the States in particular, in the US in particular, it all started. I mean, there were sort of premises before, but it all started by the decision. So we were in the early 70s, 73, 74, the decision of a UN subcommission on minority discrimination, human rights, not to include the Armenian genocide to the list of past genocide. Basically, they were publishing a report. We talked about it with Taner today. They were to publish a report, and they decided not to include I think it was the introduction to the report or preamble to the report, the Armenian genocide as case of genocide under Turkish pressure. For Armenian Americans and Armenian American activists in particular, for what we call the organized Armenian community, that is to say mostly two lobbies, although other lobbies had existed and other groups existed, other people also were influential, but mostly two lobbies. The Armenian Assembly of America created in 72. So that's basically the period I'm talking about now. And the Armenian National Committee of America, a branch of the Dashnak party that pre-existed, but that was reshaped in the 70s and 80s. Anyway, so these two groups in particular mobilized against this decision by only a subcommission. We're talking of a relatively small institution, a subcommission of the United Nations, decided to mobilize not only because of the decision of the subcommission, but also because the American delegate to the subcommission decided to vote against the inclusion of the Armenian genocide to the list. Basically, concretely, it meant that this gentleman, but behind him, the executive branch, the State Department, decided to align actually with Turkey, and that was not acceptable for Armenian Americans. So that's when they started to mobilize. I think it's at that time that they understood that not only the State Department was, let's say, pro-Turkey in general, to put it in simple terms, that had been obvious for a few decades after the Second World War, integration of Turkey to NATO, Cold War, blah, blah, blah. Truman Doctrine and so on, but also that this pro-Turkish inclination had this consequence that the US, the executive branch, would not recognize the Armenian genocide. So that's basically where the struggle began. So they understood that for the executive branch, at least during the Nixon presidency, but that'd be true afterwards, as we know it, there would be no possibility. I mean, they'll try to lobby. The Armenian camp will definitely try to lobby the executive branch, but definitely not successfully. So they focused on Congress with the idea of trying to obtain recognition by Congress, to get Congress vote a law, a resolution recognizing the Armenian genocide. So that's the idea. That's how it started in the early 70s. And then basically I studied in the book for maybe 50 pages or maybe more, 70, I guess, or all the episodes in Congress, all the congressional battles for recognition of the Armenian genocide by Congress. The Armenian camp proposed bills not almost every year, and sometimes several resolutions a year. Not always, not every year, but almost. So we're talking of dozens. I don't have, actually, I should have counted them before I came, but we have dozens of cases proposal in Congress, resolution recognizing the Armenian genocide in Congress. So what's interesting to me, fascinating, I mean, that's because I like the topic, of course, fascinating to me, is that the pattern was always the same, but at the same time, every case is different. So the pattern is the same, roughly the same, in the sense that, so basically, Armenian Americans and their friends in Congress propose a resolution. It is immediately lobbied by Turkey and the executive branch, and therefore rejected by Congress. But of course, this is a good sort of too simple pattern. Of course, it's much more complex, and you have many different types of cases and so on. But basically, that's what happened for about 50 years. So now, if just to finish on this point, which is probably the most important of the book, the assessment, the overall assessment is difficult to make. It in a way, it depends if you're optimistic or pessimistic, I presume. In French, maybe in English too, we have this expression, a glass is always half empty or half full. Do you have the same expression in English? All right. So, I mean, if you want to see the glass half empty, you say, okay, Armenians and Americans and their friends have mobilized a lot of time, energy, and so on, and they did not obtain what they were looking for, that is to say, US recognition of the genocide. That's true. I mean, now the other side of the coin, or the half full glass, is to say that the Armenian camp, first of all, never gave up, and that's, I think, an interesting thing. Well, it tells a lot about the Armenian lobby, first of all, in my opinion. For those of you who are interested in the Armenian lobby, they never gave up. It's also interesting because it sent a message, it sent a signal to their opponents. I mean, when you never give up, when every year, even if you fail, you try again, and you try again in a smart way. I mean, you try to find new solutions, you change the tactics, you change the wording, you change the timing, you change the commission, for example, the congressional commission to which you're going to submit the law, and I mean, the resolution, and so on. Well, you show your opponent that you're not giving up, and as soon as there be even a small window, you will come back and you will eventually obtain the expected result. And that's eventually what happened. So for Congress, as we said before, it was 2019, through the vote of concurrent non-binding resolution by the two houses. It was what time is it? Yeah, it was a relatively easy vote on the House side, and then more difficult on the Senate, as it's always been. Of course, I could get into details if you're interested, but when I was talking of a glass half full, it's also because actually the Armenian camp obtained interesting results throughout the years. They did not obtain a full recognition by Congress, but they obtained 2 votes in the House. So the House actually had recognized the genocide before 2019. They obtained significant results in congressional commissions. They obtained significant results also at the state and local levels, and that's important here in California, for example, in Los Angeles, and so on. I'm not developing, but that's interesting and important too. Anyway, so that was basically as I said, the central part of the book. Now to finish with, if I'm fine in terms of time, just to finish with a few words on the last part of the book, which is hopefully also an interesting and important one, because basically in this last part, I try to answer the question I asked to myself decades ago. So on the reasons of this US policy, and So something I've not said before, but I think it's important to insist on, it's not only one decision or several decisions repeated, once, twice, three times. What's interesting here is that we have a continuity for 50 years. The same policy was maintained, no matter the geopolitical context, no matter the political context in Washington, D.C., political party of the people in the White House or Congress and so on. So that's also what is fascinating, I think, with this question. It's a quite remarkable example of continuity in policy in Washington, D.C. Anyway, so this last part on the reasons, basically I divided this part into three main points, three main categories, let's say, of reasons. First, of course, I focus on Turkey, the importance of the geopolitical argument. So I try to do it, maybe not in an innovative way, but I try to do it my way. I try to show, for example, that it was a complex argument, this geopolitical argument, that sometimes it was used as a sort of tool or as a card by the executive branch vis-à-vis Turkey. So these are all the things I discuss. I also insist on the fact that it's not only geopolitics, in the sense of military and strategy or geostrategy. It's also economy, geoeconomy. It's also what we call in DC the military industrial complex, also behind Turkey and behind the for non-recognition and so on. So that's definitely the main point. And in other words, it is clear that without Turkey insisting so much on this non-recognition of the genocide internationally and so on, it seems obvious to me that the US would have recognized the Armenian genocide before. So that's one point. The second point is that, however, I think you may tell me your opinion, but I think geopolitics per se is not much. I mean, geopolitics needs people behind to create and support narratives. Geopolitics is like an idea, but then you have, especially here in the US, in Washington, D.C., you have people to create, to produce a convincing narrative. And then you need people to support the point of view that you want to express. And that is to say, we go back to lobbying. I mentioned lobbying in reference to Armenian Americans, but of course there was and still is a strong Turkish lobbying. So what I want to say here is that it's not only geopolitics, is that people in DC push for this geopolitical vision of a sort of indispensable Turkey geopolitically, blah blah blah. It's really, I think it's a very important point. So basically, the second category of arguments in this last part is about Washington, D.C., this microcosm, and the fact that it has also permitted this line of this non-recognition line to be maintained throughout the years. I also insist a bit on the State Department, on the force of inertia of the State Department, on the fact that elites in DC at the State Department and not only tend to, let's say, reproduce themselves in a way, generation after generation, and that helps, that participate in maintaining a position, a line. I mean, that's one point. And the last series of arguments that I thought important to develop are the one related to the US relationship with history, and especially the dark pages of history. And that basically, to put it in simple terms, and I apologize, it may be too simplified, but basically what was asked was for a country whose whose own past is extremely difficult, relating to Native American, the destruction of Native Americans and slavery, to recognize the wrongdoings of another state and another nation. So concretely, I found very precise examples of references to this issue, to the dark pages of US history, to justify US non-recognition. Namely, some senators, I mean congresspersons, both senators and representatives, put it in very clear terms. I mean, they said before recognizing the dark pages of other nations, we should focus on our own history. I mean, they put it in very different way. And this argument is interesting too, because it's used by both opponents, first and foremost opponents to recognition, but also possible supporters of recognition. So I think it's an important argument, and it had not been discussed. I mean, it had been mentioned briefly in one article, one paper, but it had not been discussed, and that's what I tried to do. So I think that's it. I guess I can stop here.
If you have some concluding remarks, continue.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to conclude on this point because I found it important, and I think that be probably something to work on and to discuss even more. My idea with this argument in particular was to put this Armenian recognition issue within a broader picture, the broader picture of basically memory, the links between memory and politics in the United States. And that's I think that was something important to do, and I hope we'll keep digging this way, because there's much to understand and to better understand, in my opinion. And I can stop here. That's fine. I'd be happy to discuss.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Julian, for this really wonderful talk. And now the floor is open. I have, of course, thousands of questions, but of course, the audience has the preference. Yes, Anne.
Thank you so much. What a fascinating talk. I'm curious if you made any kinds of direct comparisons between the U.S. response and political pressures to deny the Armenian genocide, or at least not to recognize, and those happening in France. Because surely in the United States, it was well known that the Republic of Turkey was paying lobbyists, former members of Congress, very prominent ones like Richard Gephardt and so forth, who lobbied very aggressively against recognition. Did that kind of thing ever happen in France? And with respect to, the U.S. is not wanting to delve too deeply into another country's violent treatment of indigenous people because of what they did. And France also was, colonial power and so forth. Did you make any kind of comparison there?
I did not in the book, but that's something I had in mind, like almost constantly in mind, actually. And yes, I mean, it's obvious that Turkey did operated the same pressure in France as it did in the US, probably at lower level. Well, this I don't know, actually. It's difficult to compare. Plus, the political system in the US and in DC in particular is different than in France. But what is clear is that you had, significant and multifold, let's say, or multiple lobbying methods and so on used in France as well as it was the case in the US. So that's obvious. But I also realized, and that was what was at the beginning, I think, of my interest in the topic. I also realized that in France, not much happened after France recognized the Armenian genocide. I mean, Turkey promised some sort of apocalypse, and I wouldn't say nothing happened, but not much happened. I mean, I think a few contracts were cancelled, and but that, so for people who are concerned by this contract, it may have been important. And unfortunately, politics is often a very circumstantial thing. So, but at the end of the day, it was really not much. And on the long run, it did not change much, as actually it did not change much here after US recognition of genocide.
If I may add one point, actually, that's a very interesting comparison. You use the term military industrial complex. I mean, it was the same in France. Maybe you may recall, I think 999 or 2000, when the first attempt was made in French parliament and Turkey pressured France. And then there was a military agreement buying a huge number of helicopters from France, and it was dropped by government. So this was really an important incentive for French government to drop the case. And in United States, it is also almost the same. It was used, the Incirlik Air Base, the central argument over the years, and the military contracts that they had already. They used also as a leverage in their hand. So it's...
And then your second question was more about the
treatment of indigenous population and so forth.
And maybe in the case of France, it's more the colonial past of France. And yes, it's been definitely mobilized by Turkey for a while, actually. Erdogan quite much, but before Erdogan, it had already been mobilized both vis-a-vis the United States and same in France. So they do the same in France. They particularly refer to Algeria, colonial Algeria, and a genocide that would have been committed in colonial Algeria by France. Well, it's an interesting thing. To some extent, it's not really credible, but I think it may have worked. And in the case of the US, I think it's been more significant because the US really constructed itself as Turkey, actually, as Turkey Ottoman Empire constructed itself, at least partially, on the destruction of other groups. The case of France, it's different. It's more colonial history and so on. In the case of the US, there are similarities, I'd say. Although comparison is difficult, but still.
Yes, but
can you speak about the role that the Cold War plays in this history?
The role of the Cold War? Well, during the Cold War, it was mostly indeed the geopolitical argument that played an important role, of course, because Turkey was seen as an important partner, NATO partner, and so on. What else could we say? There was also internal Armenian politics that were at stake or played a role during the Cold War. Some tended to be close to the United States, especially, I mean, not always, but the Dashnak Suchun, the Dashnak party, at different times was close to the United States, mostly because it was in a logic of rejection of the USSR and Soviet Armenia and so on. Whereas other groups were closer to, not to the Soviet Union, but to the idea of Soviet Armenia and so on. So that was also what was at stake. And for some among the Armenian diaspora, especially in the 60s, I'd say 50s, 60s, 70s, the genocide may not have been not central, but not the only issue. I mean, the issue was also the relation to Soviet Armenia and therefore the Soviet Union, and they may not have been that willing to push the US to recognize because they preferred being aligned with the United States in rejection to the USSR and to Soviet Armenia.
Sebu, before you, I have to add another additional question to the called for period. Maybe you can talk. I know you mentioned in your book extensively. There was also and period where United States officially recognized the Armenian genocide. It was 1952, and then it's forgotten then afterwards. So this is an interesting thing. If you talk a little bit about it, it shows the differences between really different administrations.
Actually, 52 is a real recognition. The later one.
Yes. Yes. What's interesting, I think, with the 52 moment or the 51, 52 episode is that at that time it was not so central, like actually for the stakeholders we're talking about. I mean, neither Armenian Americans, Turkey may not be at that time so focused on the term genocide, and same with the United States. So at that time it was probably viewed as something.
Still new.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And indeed, in this research, I discovered actually an earlier reference to the Armenian genocide in the U.S. archives. Basically, the document we most of the time we refer to is a document by the State Department. But prior to this document emanating from the State Department, there was another one signed by the Department of Justice. And actually, the one by the State Department reproduces more or less the one published before, or circulated before by the Department of Justice. But anyway, what's important here is that at that time, the term genocide may not have been that central, but when it became important, when they become to have some sort of polarization then you have different camps, and the camps were fighting hard for or against using the term.
No, I have a simple question. Thank you very much for your talk first. My question has to do with the distinction that seems to be there between the terms non-recognition and denial. You again and again go over underline the term non-recognition.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if you could clarify or elaborate on that difference. Is there a difference really between those two terms? And if you could just speak to that a little bit longer.
Yes. Thank you, Sibu. That's a very important question. When I published my first article on this topic in 2013, I hesitated on what term I should use, and finally I coined. I mean, it's a bit vain to put it this way, but I decided to opt for this non-recognition term because I thought, and I still think that we had to make a difference between denialist Turkey and Azerbaijan, by the way, and the position of the United States and other countries that most of the time did not deny. We have a few cases where they tend to do, but most of the time they do not deny. They just say basically, we don't know, we're not sure, we don't want to talk about. They do not say it did not happen.
Yeah.
So I think we had to make some sort of difference. But I think that should be conceptualized in a better way. I mean, I agree.
I fully support your position, because in some cases, if you read the justification of the senators or the executive branch, they openly said, we know what happened, but because of our interest, national interest in the Middle East, we don't want to jeopardize our relations. So knowing that it happened, bad things and it's genocide, but we are not really inclined to use this term. So this was
that's the point. And some others are on a slightly different line. They tend to say basically, excuse my French, we don't care. Either we don't care, we don't know, we know, but we don't want to. But this is not exactly saying it did not happen.
Yeah.
Can I just follow up with that? And then I'll. So, if the go ahead. Sorry.
No,
I lost track of what I was saying. Yeah.
Okay. My definition of denial and non-recognition is very clear. Denial, did it happen or not? The fact, the massacres, deportation, you cannot deny that. Recognition is a more legal kind of thing. Okay. The word genocide, recognition. And I've always thought, in my opinion, and still do, that, for example, you said that eventually the United States recognized simply because the president used the word genocide. All right. I do think that what Biden did was the following. In the beginning, by the way, for your own thesis, the most important thing for me is the disarming of what the convention was taken, what Lemkin presented, and they saw that they all are in trouble from their own history, all the larger nations, colonialism, the United States, and so forth. And basically, they disarmed it. Okay? And once they disarmed it, what happened is this, they ended up with the convention cannot be applied anywhere else. Okay? Practically. And one word is ending up to keep that thing. Okay? Intention. Prove it. And therefore, to me, the Genocide Convention is a non-functional kind of thing. Other than that, coming to Biden's position, over time, the word genocide got diluted away from the legal term and became a political term. And eventually, it ended up being a moral term. And therefore, the debate, if anybody wants to debate, when Biden used the word, he definitely was not legal because he's not a court. And therefore, did he do it the political meaning of genocide or the moral? But either way doesn't have teeth. And hence, the arguments that you're making, okay, the genesis of it was the process of disarming that convention to a non-functional legal term.
Yes, I agree.
And that's one. The second thing that I have, in your book, do you cover the lobbying against recognition by Israel and the Jewish community in the United States?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, I do. Quite. Yeah.
Big part.
Yes. Yes, it's a big topic, and I would add. Sorry, if I may, you may disagree, but I would add to this package in a way the question of the uniqueness of the Holocaust, which also
it played also a role.
yeah, it played a role. Yeah,
Not just unique.
That's right. That played a role. Again, it's not just an idea. It's because it was mobilized, officially mobilized by people who opposed recognition in Congress. So the uniqueness of the Holocaust. Then, yeah, Jewish pro-Israeli lobby also played an important role. At the same time, I also realized that the Jewish Holocaust was also mobilized sometimes to promote Armenian genocide recognition and so on. So that's a complex issue.
That's an Israel-Turkey deal.
What do you mean?
No,
That
Jewish
came from
scholars,
Israel,
mainly,
Turkey.
Jewish scholars is mainly in the United States. They helped a lot, towards the recognition of Armenian genocide.
Yeah.
It was a major,
Yeah.
if you ask me. Maybe, Yehuda Bauer, one of the leader of the Holocaust studies, he was really very active getting the Armenian genocide recognized among the Jewish scholars and among the American Jewish community and overall in the world. So,
In the scholarship, there is no doubt. There was a lot of Jewish scholars who were talking about. But on the political side, AIPAC and so forth,
Yeah,
were big time.
that's right.
Time. Okay? And
That's
Israel
obvious.
directly also.
That's obvious, and it was
Big time.
it was very, very strong in the 80s and even more 90s and 2000s. But at the same time, you had also a lot of Jewish leaders, including political leaders, who played a major role in this recognition effort. Congresspersons in particular, from California, for example, and others. So it's a complex issue. Yeah.
Even this case that is so prominent in the news about Mayor Eric Adams. One of the requests from the Republic of Turkey was that he not recognize the Armenian genocide in the city of New York. Right.
Yes, Erdem. Sorry, Sebu.
No, please.
Yeah, go ahead, Erdogan.
Regarding the question of geopolitics and importance of Turkey, to what extent it was about not recognizing, it was about appeasing Turkey versus using it as a leverage against Turkey from the perspective of the United States?
That's a good question. Unfortunately, it's too difficult to get a precise answer, at least in my case. Something I didn't say before relating to the sources I used. I did approximately 30, I mean, between 25 and 27 or 28 interviews with political actors, lobbyists, and so on. People, I would say not high-ranking official of the State Department, but still officials from the State Department, 4 or 5 people. And it's very difficult to precisely know. I mean, I would tend, but it's more a feeling than anything else. But my feeling is that I would not underestimate this sort of geopolitical card or leverage. We know that it's been used at least once during the Bush 43 presidency, and more recently by Donald Trump, interestingly enough, during his first mandate. So we know that it's been used, but I think most of the time the idea was not to take any risk. That was also a matter of pragmatism. I mean, what was in a very like realistic approach, pragmatic approach of international relations, what was the interest for the US to recognize the Armenian genocide? There was no, or hardly. I mean, there was moral, obviously, and that's actually what is central in that matter. I mean, that was a moral issue, that was a matter of principle, but geopolitically speaking, there was no reason to take any risk with Turkey. Any risk. I'm not even saying like doing harm to the relation. I'm just saying taking risk with Turkey. So that's what was most central to me. If I may, another thing I was told by a few people in DC was that basically, again, this idea of force of inertia in the State Department, in particular, NSC to some extent, Department of Defense to some extent, also played a role. In other words, it was easier to keep it this way. It was easier not to make any change, not to change the position, and to, that was. I mean, these people in DC. That's what I was told, in particular by someone from the State Department, who said that their task is already quite difficult, so they try to avoid any additional trouble, let's say, or complication, or the easiest, the better.
I mean, I can reveal one secret information, kind of public secret information. Before recognition of Armenian genocide by Biden administration, a lot of Armenian genocide scholars were asked by Pentagon, and our opinion was important for them to make this twist going over to recognition. You couldn't write this in your book because it's really a kind of, I know we were visited officially, and we also informed our universities. It was not in that sense secret. I mean, my Clark University, the administration knew about it, and this was really a long-term thought attempt of administration. It was not a simply decision of Biden itself. So,
yeah.
I have another question, unless
Go
someone
ahead.
wants to. So perhaps you won't want to answer this question, but I have to ask it anyway. So in 2019, when both houses of the US Congress did vote to recognize and acknowledge the Armenian genocide, Donald Trump was the president at the time, and they did not acknowledge the genocide. In 2021, President Biden did acknowledge the genocide in his statement on April 24, and he has done that, or did that, 2021, 22, 23, 24. Do you have any sense, given, I mean, almost nothing that has happened in the last month for me has been very predictable. So perhaps you don't even want to speculate, but do you have any idea what he will say on April 24, 2025?
I mean, I would love to continue. It's an excellent question because, you know, all the decisions are not binding.
Mhm.
They are not legal
That's
decisions.
right. That's
They are
right.
symbolic acknowledgement. If Trump says it was not a genocide based on the financial agreements with Turkey, what would happen?
Yeah, right. It would be
This is-
different as
this is
a
the
policy of
question.
this country, but for him personally, it could have ramifications.
This is of course
Not knowable.
difficult to
Yeah.
predict. I mean,
Sorry.
with Trump, everything
Depends who's playing golf with.
Yeah. everything seems to be like 50-50.
Yeah.
A possibility also is that he says nothing. He does not publish any
Yeah.
statement, or that's also another possibility.
I'll be surprised if you mention.
Yeah,
Well,
Yeah, I
he
don't
did
know.
make that, he called it the Mentieren, just as President Obama did for 4 years in a row.
yeah.
It'll be curious.
Yes, they would.
I have a historiographic question that's not practical in the sense of what's going on at the present. You mentioned in on one of your slides, you had photos of a number of important works on genocide denialism and recognition, quests for recognition, including, of course, by my predecessor, Professor Ovanesian, even and also his student Payastian, and even Balikian, right? So my question to you is, I didn't notice any reference in your work, and I haven't read it thoroughly yet, to another important scholar of genocide denialism, someone who actually does analytically rewarding and interesting analysis of why the genocide industry, the denialist industry, function the way it did in the US, especially in relation to Turkey, and that is Jennifer Dixon, who has
Yes.
a number of essays that are excellent. I assigned them in my upper
Yes.
division undergraduate class, but I understand she also has a book. So I'm wondering if you want to comment on why she's not there, and if and what thoughts you might have on this kind of scholarship.
Yeah, I know her. I know some of her works, but I think, if I'm not mistaken, but that I may use some of her works, or like briefly, but it was not. I had this feeling that it was not so central to my topic. So, but I know that, of course, I know her, and
She mainly compared Turkey with Japan.
Japan, exactly.
Yes, but
attitude
also
towards
her she has an excellent essay on the 1980 to 82 to 2000, I guess,
Yeah.
2005 period, which focuses on Turkish institutional mechanisms of denial in the US.
Yes.
Um,
Yeah, I know her work, but I probably didn't use it. I could not find it, at least in this version of the book. I don't have the reference, but I know a bit of her work, and yeah. The thing is, denialism, as we discussed it briefly before, was not so central to my research. I mean, the mechanism here in the US, yes, and that played a role. But I really didn't want this book to be like, in a way, Turkey centered. That was not my point. What I really wanted to study basically were the political processes in DC with regards to recognition of the genocide. So I have a few lines or paragraphs, I guess, on denial, but it's not that big, and I use a few authors, Roger Smith in particular, a few others.
Any other question from the audience?
We covered most, but someone is asking whether or not the US was willing to use the term crimes against humanity throughout the years to describe what happened during the Armenian genocide.
I think at the very beginning they were not in favor, That is to say, during the massacres. Tanner, maybe that's something you know, but from what I recall, the US was not very favorable to using this term. And then, yes, I think you said crimes against humanity, right? I have an article on the topic of the proclamation, statement, messages of US presidents that is going to come out soon. But now I'm not sure, but I think it's been used. I would need to double check, but I think it's been used by US presidents when they try to avoid term genocide. They use crime against humanity. I'm almost sure, but I would need to double check.
Maybe indirectly related to it, then why Reagan recognized the Armenian genocide? And why not the other president?
That's an excellent question. In my opinion, what's interesting with Reagan is not so much in the way where he recognized, but why he recognized once and then totally switched his position. That's fascinating.
Yeah.
And in a very tough way. I mean, I think it's in his memoirs, or maybe diaries, is almost dismissive about the Armenian genocide, Armenian massacres, and so on. Whereas, indeed, in 1991, it was a proclamation. So he published this statement using the term genocide. So we all know that behind the scenes that there was Kenneth Hachikian.
Yeah.
Was the author actually of this proclamation. That's a well-known fact. And we know a bit about the process, how Mr. Hachikian did, and that it was validated by, if I'm not mistaken, by White House staff and NSC as well, but not State Department, but White House and NSC. So if I may insist a bit and develop a bit your question, what's really interesting here is why and how Reagan changed his mind actually on the Armenian genocide. I don't have the answer. I discuss the topic in the book, and we have a few hints. But one possibility is that it may relate to Armenian terrorist act that took place, if I'm not mistaken, in 1992, with two killings, one in Boston and one in Los Angeles.
92?
Yeah, I think it was 92, and yeah.
92? It was 1970s.
82, I say. What did I say?
You said
90? Oh, my bad.
Yeah.
Sorry. 82. So just after the year after he recognized the Armenian genocide with this proclamation, there was this increase in terrorist acts on U.S. soil. So that may have participated in changing Reagan's mind on the topic.
Using the word doesn't mean recognition. I mean, I think it's stretching too much.
And if I may, maybe not using the word, as Tana said a few minutes ago, not using the word does not mean not recognizing. I mean, it's clear we have a few examples. Tanner was very explicit with one example, but we have many examples and testimonies of people who would say, of course it was genocide, but we cannot, it's not our policy.
Genocide, though.
Yeah.
If you use the word genocidal,
Yeah.
okay, it's describing something. Okay, but when you use the word genocide, it's pure legal term. And pure legal terms have their own universe, which is legal.
That's right.
Or
That's right.
and so on and so forth. And I've always, and I had it Professor Hovanesyan, Dadurian, and so on. I said, stay away from this genocide. To use the word genocide and move forward. The whole Jewish Holocaust word, is avoiding to use the word genocide because they understand that legally it doesn't apply to them. That's it. I mean, when it happened, the convention wasn't there.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Is there any other?
I'm sure there are many questions.
Thank you, Julia. Thank you. Let me make some closing remarks. So thank you very much for this really fascinating talk. And we truly appreciate your time and insight and wish you great success in your future research and academic endeavors. Before we wrap up, I would like to take a moment to highlight some exciting upcoming events. In fact, we have an important conference happening this very Friday, the 22nd Annual Graduate Student Colloquium in Armenian Studies, organized by the Department of Near Eastern Language and Cultures. This international conference provides a platform for graduate students in the humanities and social sciences to present their research on various aspects of Armenian studies, from history to literature and to anthropology, sociology, and history. We encourage you to attend and support the next generation of scholars in our field. And next week, we are also honored to host a lecture by the esteemed historian Ronald Grigor Suni, organized by the UCLA History Department, Richard Hovhannisyan, endowed chair in modern Armenian history, and then UCLA Music Department's Armenian Music program in collaboration with the Promise Armenian Institute. And Professor Suni will speak about the legacy of his grandfather, the renowned Armenian composer Grigor Mirzayan Suni, a conversation not to be missed. Of course, these are just few highlights. Many more events are coming up. So we encourage you to visit our website and follow our social media pages to stay informed. Finally, I would like to express my also sincere appreciation to our dedicated team, especially Hazmik Bagdasaryan and Deputy Director of the Promise Armenian Institute, and Nanor Harponian, Program Coordinator of Armenian Genocide Research Program, whose hard work behind the scenes has made this event possible. Thank you so much, and thank you for very Thank you.
Thank you so much. Fascinating talk. I debated whether to ask you about this, but it's just, I can't imagine.
That's an interesting question. Yeah.
Well, especially